Okay, welcome to Raaonline. Today we will be discussing about internal capsule, which is a very important case also, and also an essay question in your anatomy paper, and also very important for medicine postgraduates and also DM neurology. Coming to the case, so the case goes like this. A 55-year-old male, a known hypertensive for 20 years, not on regular medication, one day in his office suddenly felt giddy and weakness in his right upper and lower limb. He was admitted in the intensive care unit and was found to have a BP of 170 by 140, which is a very high BP, and inability to move his right side limbs with loss of sensation on the right side. So there was a right-sided hemiplegia with right-sided hemianesthesia. The CT brain was done along with other baseline investigations. So he actually presented with stroke, something like stroke. He's a known hypertensive also for 20 years, and he felt giddy and he felt weakness first, and he suddenly felt giddy and weakness. His BP was high. He was rushed to the hospital because stroke is something like we have to take the patient as fast as possible to the hospital and the stroke unit. What did the CT brain reveal? That is the first question. What is the likely diagnosis in this case? What could be the likely cause of this condition? And name the structure involved in this subject or patient, and what are its parts. So now coming to the anatomy aspect of the structure involved in this case. This is a typical case of a person having a stroke, and the anatomy of stroke, if we have to discuss, definitely we have to discuss about the white matter of the cerebrum. So let's start the white matter of the cerebrum. So basically the cerebrum, if you see that it has two hemispheres, right? So you have a gray matter which is on the outer surface, which is called the cerebral cortex, and below this gray matter you can see these are the white matter. So this is the white matter, and you have some nuclei also which are scattered within the white matter. So this is the basic concept of cerebrum. So it is a compact mass of bundles of axonal fibers and neuroglia. So this is mainly the white matter is what? It is actually the axons and neuroglial cells. Whereas what is the gray matter? Gray matter is nothing but the cell bodies of the neurons. So the gray matter which is outside, always in the CNS, in brain, we have the gray matter outside, which forms the cerebral cortex, the cerebellar cortex, whereas the white matter is inside. So, whereas in case of spinal cord, you will see that the white matter is outside. So, outermost part forms the white matter, whereas the gray matter lies inside. So, it's a basic concept to understand the neuroanatomy of cerebrum. Then what does the white matter form? It forms a large volume of the cerebral hemispheres. You can see these are all white matter which are forming a large volume of the cerebral hemisphere. Now coming to the specific learning objectives of this session is you have to know the internal capsule in detail, because in that case internal capsule is what is involved, I am telling. Definitely the clinical anatomy becomes very important in this aspect. Now coming to a basic classification of white matter. So you can see over here, these are the two halves of the cortex, and these two halves of the cortex are getting connected with each other by some white matter. The cortex, the cerebral cortex, is also one side. If you see one side, it is getting connected with each part. So these are called the sulci, and these are the gyri. The depressions are the gyri, and the elevations are called the sulcus of the cerebrum, and they are connected. So two adjacent sulci are also connected, and even one side pole is also connected to that same side pole of the cerebral cortex. So those are called the association fibers when it is within one side of the cortex. When the fibers are crossing across and connecting one side of the cortex to the other side of the cortex, cerebral cortex, they are called cross fibers or commissural fibers. Commissural means they are crossing. So one of the most important commissural fiber is corpus callosum. We are not coming to that in this class because we will be only focusing at this pink color fibers which are either coming out of the cerebral cortex and going to the different other parts, lower centers, that is you have the pons, you have the medulla oblongata or the spinal cord, or they are receiving the fibers from all these different centers of the lower centers, that is the spinal cord, the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, and they are going up to the cerebral cortex. So this kind of fibers which are not limited to the cerebrum itself, it is projecting either down or things which are coming up into the cerebral cortex or cerebrum. These fibers are called the projection fibers. So as the name suggests, they are not limited to the cerebral cortex, neither to each cortex. These fibers are actually communicating with the other parts of the central nervous system, little bit lower centers. They are lower than the cerebral cortex, and these are called the projection fibers. So now we are coming to, you can see over here that this is one cerebral hemisphere and this is one cerebral hemisphere, and we have labeled the three types of white matter of the cerebral cortex in three different colors. So you have one color which is blue, which is mainly connecting one sulci to the other sulci, nearby sulcus, and there is also some fibers which will be connecting the same side from one lobe to the other lobe. So those are also association fibers, and the green color fibers are nothing but the commissural fibers which are crossing from one cerebral hemisphere to the other cerebral hemisphere, and the projection fibers are some fibers which are coming down from one cerebral hemisphere to the different centers below. Okay, so these are the this is how we classify the white matter of the cerebrum. Now coming, today's class is, because it is a case-based essay question and a clinical case-based class or an early clinical exposure for you, we are going to only concentrate on projection fibers, because the case is like that. The case is a stroke case which will be actually the clinical presentation when these projection fibers are getting involved. So if the projection fibers are getting involved, you are getting a clinical case scenario which we have presented. Okay. So what are these projection fibers? So these projection fibers are connecting the cerebral cortex with the subcortical centers. So these are connecting the cerebral cortex with the corpus striatum, with the thalamus, with the brainstem, and receiving impulses and giving out impulses or commands to the different part, and also spinal cord. So they are basically, they will also give commands and they will also feel or receive impulses. So they can be of, these fibers will be motor and sensory both, right? Because they will be giving commands to do certain things and they will be also receiving impulses from different subcortical centers. So let's see the different types of fibers which are present in this projection fibers. You have something called corticofugal fibers. Now, fugal means what? Whenever we read in physics also, fugal means it is going away, okay, from the center. So, if you take the cerebral cortex as the center, as the master, so it is going away from the cerebral cortex. So, the fibers which goes away from the cerebral cortex, which comes down and gives commands, basically, they are the corticofugal fibers. Whereas some fibers definitely will have to come up to the cerebral cortex, the different areas of the cerebral cortex, and there are some sensory cortex which is the area number 312 of the cerebral cortex. So fibers which comes up, which carries the information and comes up to the cortex, they are called corticopetal fibers. Petal means you come to the center. Okay, so something towards the center is petal, something which is going away from the center is fugal. So you have corticofugal fibers, you have corticopetal fibers. So petal fibers are fibers which are coming to the cerebral cortex from other centers in the central nervous system. Okay, so with this basic, we are understanding that projection fibers are fibers which are coming to the cerebral cortex, or certain fibers which are coming out from the cerebral cortex, and they carry information from the cerebral cortex to different subcortical centers, or they carry information from the subcortical centers to the cerebral cortex. So this part is very clear. Now, projection fibers of the neocortex. So if we say this is the neocortex, and what is the projection fibers which are very, very important? are the corona radiator fibers. You can see these corona radiator fibers, and these corona radiator fibers will become a very compact group of fibers, compact band of fibers as they go inferior medial aspect of the cerebrum. So as we go down, so the corona radiator fibers are actually spreading out. It is going to the different centers, right, on the cerebral cortex. Cortex, as I am meaning, cortex means the gray matter. So the cortex is very expanded. It's all spread out. It has a lot of folds. So they spread out. These fibers spread out and goes to different parts of the cortex. Whereas as you go down means as you go inferior medially, in your cerebral hemispheres, you get these fibers as a very compact band, which is called the internal capsule. So you can see over here, this is actually forming the internal capsule. Now there are some projection fibers of archicortex and paleocortex. So cortex, as you know, that cerebral cortex can be divided into a neocortex, archi and paleo, depending upon the evolution, right, how the needs are. So in case of humans, the neocortex is very well evolved, whereas the archicortex and paleocortex will give some projection fibers of these centers, of their subcortical centers, which are involved with the functions of archi and paleo, and these are the fimbriae and the fornix. So fimbriae and fornix are also projection fibers, but for archicortex and paleocortex. Fine. So now just to give you an example of, we are now concerned in this case particularly with this internal capsule. So if you observe a bunch of flowers, a bouquet or a bunch of flowers when they are given to you, you know that the bunch has a place where it is tied together. All the stalks of the flowers will be tied together, and then up on the upper part of the bunch, what happens? These all flowers will be spread out. So something like that, you can compare the corona radiata. So these are the spread out flowers, okay, and as you go down, this is like a bouquet. So this part, all these fibers are very well compacted together. So if a small part of this bouquet, if you cut, then what happens? Lot of flowers will fall off. So lot of flowers will become like non-functional. So that's what I am telling, that this is corona radiata. Compare these flowers with corona radiata, which is spreading out in a bouquet, and compare the place where you hold the bouquet, where it is tied together. That part you compare with the internal capsule. So internal capsule is an area where all these fibers are very compact in the inferior medial aspect of the cerebrum. Okay, so now let's go to the next slide. So the projection, we are focusing on internal capsule as we have told. So internal capsule, definitely you're going to write the answer like this. So where is it? It is what type of fiber, what type of white matter? It is a type of projection fibers. It is a bundle, which is a compact bundle made up of sensory fibers and motor fibers. I told you that definitely the corticofugal fibers and the corticopital fibers. So corticofugal fibers, which are going out from the cerebral cortex, we will take it as motor fibers, whereas pital fibers, which are coming to the cerebral cortex, can be taken as the sensory fibers, which are responsible for sensory and motor innervation of the opposite half of the body. Why opposite half? Because these tracks are crossed at different subcortical centers. So either it has crossed at the level of spinal cord or it has crossed at the level of medulla oblongata. So these fibers have crossed. So it is always controlling one side. Internal capsule will always have the fibers of the opposite half of the body. Where is it situated? So next sub point or the key point, you are going to write about situation. So it is a compact bundle of projection fibers. Internal capsule, you can see over here, compact bundle of projection fibers, which is situated definitely in the inferior aspect of the cerebrum and inferior medial aspect. It is not in the lateral, it is in the medial aspect of the cerebrum. You can see over here. And you can see some nuclei over here which are scattered within the white matter of the cerebrum. And just below the cerebrum, you are also getting the diencephalon or the thalamus. So you can see this is the thalamus medially, You have the caudate nucleus also, and laterally you have the lentiform nucleus also, and the corpus striatum also. So all these things. So these fibers are situated between the caudate nucleus and thalamus medially, and lentiform nucleus laterally. So lentiform nucleus is coming laterally, caudate nucleus is medial, thalamus is a part of diencephalon which is also situated medially. The fibers extend from the corona radiata, so they extend down from the corona radiata, and what happens below this level when it enters into the midbrain? Somewhere here it is entering into the midbrain. So in the midbrain, these fibers will continue as the crus cerebri. So you have to remember that this is the exact spot we are talking about. Just below that you are getting the midbrain. So in the midbrain it is called the crus cerebri. So if you see over here, this is the midbrain and this fiber is the crus cerebri. Okay, so it is continuing down as the crus cerebri. It will continue into the pons, into the medulla also. Fibers which are coming from the cerebral cortex and the fibers which are coming from the spinal cord, they will cross at the medulla and they go up to the cerebral cortex. But at different levels, it can go to different centers, subcortical centers. So let's go through this, where it is situated. So it is situated definitely into the inferior medial part of the cerebrum, and it extends into the midbrain as the crus cerebri. They consist of ascending fibers and descending fibers that connects the cerebral cortex with brainstem and spinal cord. These fibers are all responsible for sensory and motor innervation of the opposite half of the body. So these fibers are very important because they are carrying the main motor and sensory tracts. So that's why, because they have to reach the cerebral cortex. Now we know that in the cerebral cortex there is a motor area which is area number 4, which is in the precentral sulcus, and you have the gyrus, and you have the motor sensory area in the postcentral gyrus. You are having the area number 312. So all these fibers have to go to ultimately to different centers which are present in the cerebral cortex. So that's why they are carrying the motor and the sensory fibers from the opposite half of the body. So now coming to the, you can see over here, this internal capsule is a V-shaped structure, and this is the lateral. Remember, this part is the lateral. So always we have a lateral, and this is medial. Whatever is in towards the center is medial. So if you compare this is showing the internal capsule of this side. Okay, this side is shown over here, and this is the lateral. This is the medial. You have the head of the caudate nucleus medially. You have the thalamus medially, and the lentiform nucleus laterally. It is in the inferior medial aspect of the cerebrum, and you have the limbs. So you can see over here, you have an anterior limb, you have a genu over here, you have a posterior limb, and the retrolentiform part, sublentiform part. I'll come to the parts, but before that I'm going to tell you that it is a V-shaped structure, V-shaped compact bundle of white matter. And laterally, what is it? The V, the lateral aspect of the V is concave, and you can see what fits into it. The lentiform nucleus is fitting into it, whereas the medial aspect of the V is convex, and you get the head of the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Okay, coming to the actual importance. So if this is the cut section of the cerebral cortex, we can see this is the cut section of the cerebral cortex. So exactly where is the internal capsule? So you can see this is actually the internal capsule, and we are not able to see the lowermost part. So you can see this is the head of the caudate nucleus. If you see, this is medial, always remember this is medial, and this is lateral, and we are seeing over here, this is the head of the caudate nucleus. So this is caudate nucleus, if I say, and this is the thalamus over here medially, and this is the lentiform nucleus, which again has two parts. You have the globus pallidus over here, and you have the putamen over here. So it is divided into two parts, the lentiform nucleus depending upon the function, and you have these other parts. So you can see in the cut section, one side of the cerebrum we have seen, and you can see over here, this is the gray color. So this whole thing is the cerebral cortex. So this is the cerebral cortex. So next, So due to large number of tracts, that is axonal fibers, so large number of fibers, that is the entire corona radiata and everything is passing through this narrow space between, and it is like sandwiched between all these things, okay? So caudate nucleus, and then you have thalamus, you have all the lentiform nucleus is sandwiching these fibers through a very narrow area, and this narrow area is called the internal capsule. Even a small lesion in this narrow area can produce a widespread paralytic effect and sensory loss in the opposite half of the body. That's what I'm saying, that it is a very compact bundle. So if you are cutting a very small part also of the bouquet where you are holding, that will cut a lot of flowers actually can fall off, even a small cut. So that's how we are explaining here. Even a small part, if it is getting affected, then what can happen, that even if a small lesion, if it is happening here in the anterior limb of the internal capsule, it can cause a widespread damage to a lot of fibers which are going to the cortex. So that is a very important point, and that's why internal capsule has a lot of clinical significance. So because a large number of fibers are passing through a very compact area. So small lesion can produce a widespread paralytic effects and sensory loss in the opposite half of the body. Always remember, all these tracts are already crossed when they are at the level of the internal capsule, or they are going to cross below the internal capsule. Especially the motor fibers will be crossing below the internal capsule, like you have the pyramidal tract which will be crossing at the great pyramidal decussation in the medulla oblongata. So the tracts are either crossed like sensory tracts and then coming into the internal capsule, or the tracts are going to cross below the internal capsule. That's why always the problem will be showing in the opposite half of the body. Okay, so now afferent fibers are sensory fibers. Now we know very important point is, when we talk about the constituent fibers of the internal capsule, which is a part of your question, like you talk about the structure involved. So very important to remember that thalamus is the great sensory gateway. So thalamus gets all the sensation first, it relays in the thalamus, and then only the thalamus will send the sensory fibers to the cerebral cortex. And you know the cerebral cortex, the sensory area is in the postcentral gyrus, that is area number 312, right over here somewhere. So it is sending in the parietal lobe, right, of the cerebrum. So thalamus is something which is most important because it is giving all the fibers, and thalamic fibers are always sensory fibers which pass through the internal capsule. So I will come to that, thalamus and just we are giving a gist at this moment. So the efferent fibers are motor. So always remember, afferent is something which the cerebrum is receiving. So they are sensory, or also they are centripetal fibers, whereas efferent fibers are motor. And what is cerebrum giving out? And those are motors, and they are actually the centrifugal fibers. They pass through the internal capsule. And I told you the internal capsule is going to continue into the midbrain as the crus cerebri, whereas the internal capsule continues above and spreads out all throughout the cerebral cortex, and that is called the corona radiata. Now the name of corona radiata means radiata is something like a sunbeam. So corona is a sun. So if you see, the corona is like a sun, and the whole fibers are like spreading out, okay, throughout the cerebral cortex. So that's why the name corona radiata is being given to the fibers which spread out, okay, into the cerebral cortex, or they also start from there and they become very compact in the inferior medial aspect of the cerebrum, and they continue down. Okay, coming to the shape, because the next is, we have talked about the situation, we have talked about its importance, and now we are going to talk about the shape. So I have already spoken that the shape is a V-shaped compact bundle. So if you take a horizontal section, so what we have taken is, we have taken a horizontal section. So if the brain is something like this, and coming down, we have cut the brain like this, okay, through the inferior aspect, not like above, we have cut somewhere here, Okay, and these are not because this won't show you the internal capsule. So if the brain is like this, we have cut like this, just above the midbrain we have cut, and we can see in the this is a transverse section and we are seeing through this. So we are seeing the transverse section in a plate. Okay, and we can see this is the V-shaped internal capsule. It has 5 limbs. So coming to the parts, so you have the anterior limb of the internal capsule. So if this is anterior, remember, this is posterior. When we are seeing that in the transverse section, we are seeing it. And always remember, this is medial, this is lateral. And remember that we are not giving, that is, we are not showing both the sides. So even on this side you have another internal capsule, you have another chordate nucleus, you have the thalamus, you have the lentiform nucleus. Okay, so both the sides you have to say, but we are just showing you one side over here, but this is again happening on the other side also. Okay, so that is how we are seeing the internal capsule, and you have the anterior limb of the internal capsule. And any bend in neuroanatomy is called genu. Genu means any bend. Okay, so genu is the bend between the anterior and the posterior limb. You have a posterior limb, so the two V's are forming the anterior and the posterior limb. The posterior limb is extended backwards, extended towards the occipital lobe. You know that the occipital lobe is behind, so the posterior limb comes backwards. And that is called the retrolentiform part. Retro means what? Retro means back, right? Retro dressing style. No. So you go back. So once you go back, definitely something which is extending towards posterior aspect is called the retrolentiform part. And there is also a sublentiform part which is going below. So it is going below, something like this, which goes below the lentiform nucleus, which is not seen in this transverse section because it is at one level. So that part is called the sublentiform part. So basically you have to remember that internal capsule has 5 parts: the anterior limb, the genu, the posterior limb, the retrolentiform part, and the sublentiform part. Okay. So coming to the next most important part of the question, once you have finished telling where is the location, what is it, and then what type of white matter it is, and what are the different parts of this structure. It is a very compact structure, and what are the relations of this structure. And so you have medial relations, you have lateral relations, and what it continues superiorly as corona radiata, and what it continues inferiorly as cross cerebri. Once you have finished all this, then we are going to the constituency. Constituents. What are the constituents of the internal capsule? So what are the fibers which makes up the internal capsule? So you have the motor fibers. So first fibers which make up the internal capsule is the motor fibers. So motor fibers, you are having the corticopontine fibers and the pyramidal fibers and the extrapyramidal fibers. So when we classify motor fibers, we are going to talk about 1, 2, and 3. So this is very, very important, because you have to remember that the cerebellum is also a very important function. It has a huge function in coordination and also for tone, posture, and balance. So cerebellum is something which has to be connected to the cortex, that is cerebral cortex or the motor cortex. So how does that happen? Is through corticopontocerebellar fibers. So corticopontocerebellar fibers are fibers which passes through the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay. So when we come to cerebellum, we will be talking about that, but at this moment you have to remember the cortex is very well connected to the pons, and in the pons it synapses and crosses over to the other side, these fibers, and goes to the cerebellum. So cortex is connected to the cerebellum through corticopontocerebellar fibers, which are motor fibers, because they are going to influence your motor activities. They are going to put a coordination, smoothen your motor activities. They are also going to maintain tone, posture, balance. Okay, so that's why these fibers are also considered as the motor fibers, because they are going to help your motor system. Okay, so that is the first fibers, corticopontine fibers. We'll come to the motor fibers in detail. Just I'm enumerating the fibers which you have to remember to draw in the internal capsule and write. Coming to the sensory fibers, so I said to you that which is the great sensory gateway. The sensory, all the sensations have to pass through the thalamus. So this is the thalamus. So all sensation except olfactory. So all sensations, okay, of the body, sensations of the body passes through the thalamus except, you have to remember this because this is a very important question, olfactory. Okay, so olfactory doesn't pass through the thalamus, it directly goes to the cerebral cortex. So what is the other sensations? You have so many sensations, right? And so all these sensations are passing into the thalamus and ending in the thalamus. That's a third order neuron, and after that it goes through thalamic radiation and goes into the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So there are different sensory areas. The most somatosensory areas, I told you 3, 1, 2. There is also auditory sense, visual sense. So all these things are there. Now coming to the motor fibers. So that details we won't go now. So now let's come to the motor fibers. Motor fibers is, we already enumerated, so corticopontine fibers. So the cerebral cortex is going to send the commands or send the impulses to the pons. So motor fibers from various lobes of the cerebrum will go to the pontine nuclei. So they will be reaching the pontine nuclei. So what are the various parts of the cerebrum? You have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, right? So you have the frontopontine fibers, the temporopontine fibers, the parietopontine fibers and the occipitopontine fibers. So frontopontine fibers are fibers which are coming from the frontal lobe, which is situated anteriorly. So remember that frontopontine is anterior, so it has to pass through the anterior limb, the genu, and also it passes through some part of the posterior limb. The parietopontine fibers and occipitopontine fibers will pass through posterior limb also, and occipitopontine, so it will pass through the more through the retrolentiform part. So this is retrolentiform because it is posterior. So occipital lobe is posterior, so it has to pass through the retrolentiform part. What about the temporopontine fibers? The temporal lobe, as you remember, of the cerebrum is located inferiorly. So that's why you are getting the temporopontine fibers through the sublentiform part. So if we see the cerebrum, and we are drawing the cerebrum like this, and you have the first, you have the frontal lobe over here, you have the parietal lobe over here, you have the occipital lobe, and you also have the temporal lobe. So definitely the frontopontine has to go through the anterior limb. The parietopontine and occipitopontine is going through the posterior limb and also through the retrolentiform part, whereas the temporopontine is going through the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So that is very important to understand. Okay, so we were talking about all the fibers which are actually present in the different limbs, which are actually the corticopontine fibers, which is definitely a motor fibers. So let's go through this. So cortex, so I have already explained this. I'm just putting a flow chart. So it goes to the same side pontine nucleus, and then it synapses, and then from the pontine nucleus the information will pass to the opposite side cerebellar hemisphere through the middle cerebellar peduncle. So this is very important, through middle cerebellar peduncle, because it comes as a spotter for you. So that's why I am just writing this middle cerebellar peduncle. It will pass through that. Okay. So this is very important. Next is, it is the most recent pathway to have developed in man, and it is very much well developed in man. Because if you remember that man has a neocerebellum which is going to control and give coordination, and also very important for preventing and smoothening, preventing any irrational movement and smoothening the movement, and with practice improving the movement. So that's why this system is very, very important for giving the movement a fine touch to the movement, giving coordination to the movement. So that is what is the neocerebellum. So what are the fibers of neocerebellum and what are the motor fibers which are passing through the internal capsule? These are the corticopontine fibers, and then from the pons it will go to the cerebellum. That is the way the cerebral cortex is connected to the cerebellum. Okay.